Welcome to this series on religion and sexuality. In the past, sex brings people out. So, well, in any case.
We notice you have that all in caps.
So, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at the attitudes and mores towards sexuality found historically in a number of the world's religions: Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, a little bit of Buddhism if thrown in there too. And then the 4th week is going to be devoted specifically to attitudes towards homosexuality. So tonight we're going to start with both Judaism and Islam. So ancient Hebrew ideas related to life in general and sex specifically were naturalistic in the sense of accepting them as divine creations. The poetic descriptions of creation, as found in Genesis 1, indicated a series of creations by divine command, including human beings, all of which are pronounced as good. Furthermore, it was proclaimed that mankind was made in the image of God. The sexual purpose given to both male and female was procreation, thus allowing mankind to participate in and continue divine creation. The first human beings were told to be fruitful and multiply. There's no need for world or sexual renunciation in Judaism. And as a result, Judaism has generally been opposed to both celibacy and asceticism. You don't find the sort of asceticism that you'll find later in Christianity in the Jewish tradition. In the second creation story, found in Genesis 2, man is created first out of clay in the person of Adam, followed by woman in the person of Eve, who is created from his side. Some translations say rib. Both were naked and unashamed. The story of the fall, the clothing of Adam and Eve, and their expulsion from the garden, was not traditionally, in terms of Judaism, interpreted as having anything to do with sex. This, as we'll see later, will be a Christian interpretation, specifically by St. Augustine, but we'll get there later, next week. Indeed, the narrative stated clearly that the sexual union of the couple came after their departure from the garden, when Adam, quote, knew his wife and went unto her so that she conceived and bore a son. So what was their fall in terms of the Jewish tradition? Their fall and punishment was a result of disobedience to the command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It didn't have anything really to do with sexuality. The original sin was thus rebellion against God and not a sexual felony. Hebrew marriage was considered a religious duty. And one rabbi claimed that a man who does not marry is not fully a man. As I said, they deprecated celibacy. You don't find celibacy as you will find it in Christianity. Priests and rabbis should marry, and the high priest was compelled to marry. It'd be like having the Pope being compelled to marry. During the early 1st century BCE, there was a monastic group known as the Essenes who thought that there was merit to be gained from sexual abstinence, but this went against the grain of tradition. They were an outside, very small group down by the Dead Sea. So it's sometimes, if there is an ascetic tradition at all in Judaism, it came from the Essenes, but they were a very small group outside of the mainstream. Men were recommended to marry from the age of 18, traditionally building a house, planting a vineyard, and taking a wife. A girl was to be married at a younger age, having ceased to be a minor at the age of 12. Well, what happens often around 12? Okay, that was considered in all ancient cultures, that was indicative that that girl was able to conceive and be married. We find that today, child abuse, but traditional cultures went kind of by nature, and this is what they felt nature was saying when the first menstruation took place. So that's why you find a lot of what we call child marriages in these cultures, and we'll see that in Islam later. As in other ancient cultures, it was the father's duty to find a husband for his daughter. Now, the importance of pleasure in marriage and procreation was emphasized by the passage in Deuteronomy 44:5, which I'm sure you all know very well. That when a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out with the army, nor shall he be charged with any business. He shall be free at home for 1 year and shall enjoy the wife he has taken. So this is the idea that, the idea of enjoyment and sexuality wasn't something foreign to Judaism. Virginity for the bride was treasured, and the text gave details of how to safeguard. The scripture allowed a man to divorce his wife on the grounds of her not being a virgin, which he would find out on their wedding night. But it also allowed the family of the bride the right to present a token of virginity, the blood-stained cloth of the nuptial bed. If this was accepted as proof, then the man would be fined for dishonoring his wife. During Temple Judaism, and that's before 70 CE, we find that polygamy was widely practiced, especially amongst the leaders in the Jewish aristocracy. You may know that King Solomon is said to have had 700 wives, as well as concubines. And David likewise had numerous wives, but he still lusted after Bathsheba. The historian Josephus, and that's the 1st century CE, claimed that polygamy was widely practiced during this time. So the time of Jesus. Okay? Polygamy was widely practiced amongst the aristocracy, mainly because you had to have some wealth to support more than one wife. And the Talmud, 3rd, 5th century, so we're moving, also sanctioned polygamy, although there were different views now starting to be expressed by the rabbis. It was finally outlawed in Judaism in the 11th century. So almost 1,000 years. Okay? It was practiced, again, usually amongst the wealthy or the aristocracy. Like other ancient cultures, the Hebrew Bible had a strong patriarchal emphasis, which in the contemporary West would probably be considered as misogynistic. We got to remember, when you're looking back at ancient cultures, when you're looking back thousands of years, it's always dangerous to project your own mental, ethical view back. Not that you can't have universal ethical values, but you got to have some context. All ancient cultures basically accepted polygamy. In any case, legally, the woman was in a position of inferiority, and the wife was possessed by her husband. Men were responsible for carrying out the precepts of the Torah, whereas women had domestic obligations. Now remember, and I'll say this later, this will change to some degree with Reform Judaism, but we're now looking at ancient Judaism. A virtuous woman is described in glowing terms in Proverbs. Do you want to hear it? She gets up before dawn to feed her household. She works wool and flax with her hands and spins with a distaff and spindle. She plants the vineyard, gives food to the needy, clothes her husband with scarlet and makes linen garments for sale to the merchants. Her children call her blessed, and her husband praises her. Similar words are found in Ecclesiastes. Happy is the husband of a good wife, a shamefast woman, a silent woman. The beauty of a good woman is like the beauty of the sun that rises in high places. Now remember, we're talking thousands of years ago. I know this might not fly today, but again, tend to have an open mind with ethical judgments on the past. Anyway, the Talmud prescribed a thanksgiving by men that they had not been made women. And this is still recited by the ultra-Orthodox from the Jewish daily prayer book. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has not made me a woman. That's still recited by the ultra-Orthodox. Before the 11th century, divorce was easy for the man. The patriarchal system allowed that the woman could be divorced with or without her consent, while the man could not be divorced without consent. And this is the patriarchal notion. It was the Rabbi Gershom, the same rabbi who eventually forbade polygamy, who in the 11th century decreed that no divorce could be effected without the consent of the wife. So there was a movement in that direction as far back as the 11th century. Grounds for divorce: unseemly behavior, which generally was taken to mean unfaithfulness, although there was one school of law said it could be anything unseemly, even bad cooking. Although intercourse with a brother's wife was forbidden, Deuteronomy 25:5 commanded a brother to take his deceased brother's wife, if she had no son, and raise up seed to his brother. So if his brother died and he had no offspring, it was his duty to provide that offspring with his brother's widow. That was law. And this practice continued almost to the time of the 1st century or Jesus. It started to be challenged about that time. Circumcision, whereby the foreskin of the penis is surgically removed, became a requirement for all Jewish males. And one way the Nazis found out if you were Jewish and a male? They had you take down your pants. In any case, the earliest historical record of circumcision, however, comes from Egypt. And it's probably likely that historians consider that's where the Jews might have picked up the practice when they were in Egypt before Moses took them out. There's actually an image of a circumcision of an adult carved into a tomb, to one of the tombs at Saqqara, dating from about 2400 BCE. It was done by the Egyptians, possibly for hygienic reasons, but also part of their obsession with purity. If you know anything about ancient Egypt, there was an obsession with purity. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, I don't know if you know of this book, but it's a book that describes what happens after death. Describes the sun god Ra as actually having circumcised himself. So if the god circumcised himself, and for the Jews, Genesis chapter 17 describes the circumcision of Abraham and his relatives and slaves, making him the first named individual to undergo the procedure. In the same chapter, Abraham's descendants are commanded to circumcise their sons on the 8th day of life. This becomes a commandment, a law. Over time, circumcision was not so much a spiritual act as a physical sign of the covenant that Jews had with God through Abraham. So if you want to know what circumcision is really all about in Judaism, it's the sign of your commitment to the covenant. And there was probably also hygienic reasons as well. And some scholars have considered that besides this, there was penal hygiene, and also an early form of blood sacrifice, which wasn't uncommon. But over time, what it really meant was this is what made you a member of the Jewish community. And it's on the 8th day. It was originally performed at home, at first by the father, and later by a specialist surgeon known as a mohel. This name appeared for the first time in the 4th century. And in the early Middle Ages, the procedure was then transferred from the home to the synagogue. Have any of you ever had Jewish friends and been to one of these celebrations? For them, it is a celebration. It's done at the synagogue by a mohel and accompanied by appropriate hymns and prayers. So it's a very spiritual symbol of becoming a member of the community. And all religions generally have very powerful symbolic notions of membership when you become an actual member. What is it in Christianity? Baptism. Baptism. Yeah, baptism. There was a lot of ritual taboo to specifically sexually oriented body parts and fluids. Both semen and blood brought ritual impurity in ancient Judaism. And I might say in most religions as well. Blood, semen, mucus, these are all seen to be impurities. Menstruation and any other female flow of blood required purification by washing clothes of the person and anyone who had touched the woman. This idea of purity is a very strong notion, which we don't practice so much overtly, but I think psychologically we still have it. Chris?
Actually, an example of that is when we were in India. My daughter and I had an apple, and she wanted to buy it. She wanted to share it, and Shruti, one of the daughters, said, "Oh, Juta." We thought, oh, something's bad. And she explained that we don't share food like that. It seems real.
A lot of it was hygienic, the notion that these things do, as we know, blood does carry disease, etc. So it was very strong. After childbirth, the mother was considered unclean for 7 days until the male child's circumcision, or 2 weeks if it was a girl. Again, semen also brought uncleanliness in either copulation or involuntary emission, wet dream. The man would be unclean until the evening, and all his clothes had to be washed. The woman would also have to bathe in water and remain unclean until evening. Masturbation was forbidden as the spilling of seed. In sexual matters, there were harsh penalties against those who deviated from what was considered normal sexual relationships. Adultery could result in the death of both individuals. Sexual intercourse during menstruation could result in expulsion from the community. The priestly code of Leviticus decreed the death penalty for male homosexuality. And I'll talk more about this in the 4th week. Okay, erotic pictorial representation has not been part and parcel of mainline Jewish tradition, partly because it was seen as unseemly, and partly due to the fact that such representation was often identified with foreign mother goddesses. If you've read the early chapters of the Torah, there's this great fear of the mother goddesses of Canaan, and the Jews are supposed to keep away from these things. So any sort of representation was seen as identified with that, if not unseemly. However, and there's always a however, there is an example in the Hebrew Bible of what can be called erotic literature. Does anyone know what book that is? The Song of Solomon, sometimes called the Song of Songs. It's part of the wisdom books. Now, it's not part of the Torah. It's not part of the first 5 books. But the Hebrew Bible isn't just the Torah. It's also got the prophets and wisdom literature. So it's divided into 3 sections. So this is in the section called wisdom literature. And some people wondered how it ever got in. And it's because it's unique in its celebration of sexual love. Now, I know you're going to all run home and get out your Bibles and start reading the Song of Songs. But it presents the voices of 2 lovers, praising each other, yearning for each other, preferring invitations to enjoy. They're in harmony and rejoicing in sexual intimacy. The women, or daughters of Jerusalem, form a chorus to the lovers, functioning as an audience whose participation in the lovers' erotic encounters facilitates the participation of the reader. It's erotic literature. Okay, now, in modern Judaism, the song is read on the Sabbath during Passover. Jewish tradition has tended to read it as an allegory. That's how you spin it. Okay? The relationship between God and Israel, not between 2 human beings. So from the more traditional sense, it's not an erotic text in the way we would understand it. But when you read it, it gets pretty... So there was also sexual language used by the Kabbalists. These are the mystics, in describing the relationship between God and what they call the tree of life. In the Kabbalist paradigm, God is known as Ein Sof, completely, absolutely ineffable, beyond any description. Can't say anything, ineffable. But from this Ein Sof emanated 10 entities that irradiated through the universe. And the last of these, which represented the harmony of all the entities, was the universal indwelling Shekinah, which is feminine. It represented the feminine attribute, now this is, you got to be careful, of the presence of God. This was held to be the case in the temple. The Shekinah was the presence of God in the temple. Not God, but the presence. Can you see that little distinction? Kind of, theologically, but there is a distinction. It's not God absolute Ein Sof, it's the presence of God. But it's feminine. And the mystics used to really, therefore, play on this. Kabbalah spoke of the reunion of the Shekinah with God in sexual imagery, of a celestial bridegroom and his celestial bride, united in sacred marriage. Okay, finally, I need to emphasize there have been a lot of changes in attitudes within Judaism over the centuries. For example, what we find in what we call Reform Judaism. And that began in Europe in the early 19th century as a means of trying to accommodate Judaism to more Western Enlightenment ideas. In general, Reform Judaism maintains that Judaism and Jewish traditions should be modernized and made compatible with participation in Western culture. That was its beginning, and it still continues to be. Does anyone here know Rabbi Mike? One of my golf partners. Okay? He is a Reform rabbi, a Reform Jewish rabbi. This means many branches of Reform Judaism hold that Jewish law should undergo a process of critical evaluation and renewal. In other words, law is something that evolves, not something that's put in stone 2,000 years ago and can never change. That's one of the big Reform notions. Traditional law is therefore often interpreted as a set of general guidelines rather than a list of restrictions whose literal observance is required by all Jews. What we would call the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law. In this regard, and this is Reform, Jews consider their conscience and the ethical principles inherent in the tradition when deciding upon a right course of action. Puts a lot more emphasis on the individual's conscience and understanding of the tradition, rather than just, what does it say in the book? And as you know, ultra-Orthodox really go that far. What does it say in the book? For example, kosher foods. I'm not going to use names, but I have a very good friend whose daughter was visiting. She called the local rabbi to find out if the M&Ms were kosher. Yeah, but there are, in fact, there are kosher M&Ms. There are in any case. For example, Reform Judaism believes in the equality of men and women. So all those earlier notions that I said have been set aside. And there is a widespread consensus among Reform Jews that the traditional distinctions between the roles of men and women are antithetical to the deeper ethical principles of Judaism. You will find this also in progressive Christianity, by the way. This notion that there are deeper ethical principles which can be known through reason and heart, not just through authority. This applies to sexuality as well as other dimensions of human life. For example, Reform Judaism has no problem with masturbation as long as it is not excessive or addictively related to pornography. Okay, let's turn now to Islam. So any discussion of sexuality in Islam needs to start with Muhammad. Why don't I have a picture of Muhammad up there? You don't have pictures of Muhammad. I've never seen a picture of Muhammad except when he might be overly veiled so you can't see the face. In any case, the reason I say this is for no other reason, and I think I discussed this in another class. For centuries, he has been maligned in the West, if not a sexual pervert, then at least oversexed. The main reason for this image is that he is said to have had 13 wives, to whom Muslims refer to as mothers of the believer. Polygamy was custom of the time in the Middle East, just like it was in ancient Judaism. And as we've seen, it was not forbidden to Jews until the Middle Ages. So there was nothing unethical as seen in having more than one wife in early Islam. Moreover, marriage was often used as a political alliance, and still is. But if you look at any kingdoms in the ancient world, and I'm sure that many of Solomon's so-called wives were politically, I mean, this is how you dealt politically. And this was to unite the tribes. The way you had united tribes and clans was to have a marriage connection. There was nothing close. So this was, we've got to keep that in mind. What's usually not mentioned, if you read, especially when you're reading people who are trying to make Muhammad look not so good, he was not married until he was 25. And then it was to this lady, Khadija. She was a widow at the time. She was a very wealthy woman. She owned one of the largest caravan routes, traveling up and down the coast of Arabia. And Muhammad was early one of her drivers. He would go on these. She found him attractive in a number of ways. And what's important is that until she died, he never had another wife. And she's always known as sort of the mother of the wives of the believers. And that was for 24 years. So it was a long time marriage. Only after her death did he take his second wife, and that was to a leading Muslim, a widow of a leading Muslim who had been killed in battle. That was the other thing. Widows in most religions, it's not the highest position. There's all sorts of problems. So that was his second wife, was the widow of one of his great warriors. So he married her, in a sense, to take care of her. That's the way you took care of women. Yeah, an unmarried woman in these cultures would be seen as close to a prostitute. Marriage was very, very. That's another reason it explains polygamy to some degree. And it was only in the last 10 years of his life that he added other marriages, generally as he was expanding the community and making political alliances. I'm not saying he didn't have sex with more than one woman, but I think you have to understand the context as well. A lot of these polygamous arrangements had other than sexual connotations to them. The main problem that most people have is with this wife. Her name was Aisha. It was his third wife. He was much older at the time. She was the daughter of his most trusted companion, Abu Bakr, who became the first caliph after he died. So there's, again, some sense of trying to understand. The problem for a lot of people is that the hadith, or the traditions, and they're questionable, not the Quran, says that she was 7 when she was married to him. This isn't problematic. The more problematic claim is that she was 9 when it was consummated. Now, other traditions say that it was 12 when it was, which would be understandable because, again, that was seen to be the sign at that time of when a female was capable of sexual relations. There's an American historian, her name is Denise Spellberg, who's done a lot of research into Aisha's life, especially regarding this notion of her virginity. And she speculates her youth might have been exaggerated to exclude any doubt of her virginity. You see the argument there? If she was married very young, okay, then she had to be a virgin. Because the problem of not, and this goes back into ancient Judaism, if you took a wife and it turned out she wasn't virgin, which could also, you can see the problems here for a woman. There could be just natural ruptures. That in any case, she's become a major problem for a lot of people speculating on Muhammad and his marriages. But like I said, child marriage was not uncommon, and it should be noted that later she was known to be very outspoken. She was very scholarly. She spread much of the information we have about Muhammad and his life. And his private life. So those are some of the issues related to Muhammad. But polygamy was common, child marriage was common. Gandhi was married when he was 13. This was just how cultures, because it was sort of, first of all, you prevent any behavior that would be seen unseemly if you're married. I mean, that's always been seen. Marry him young. Then you don't have to worry about promiscuity. That was one of the ideas. In any case, so now let's turn to the Quran. Its laws legalize sexual intercourse between husband and wife. Okay, husband and wife, no problem. It was not only for procreation, but provided a lawful institution in which sexual urges could be fulfilled. Islam is very practical here. We do have sexual drives, and it's often seen more problematic to try and repress those than allow them to be expressed, as long as they're expressed within an institutional framework that is acceptable. So there's nothing wrong with sex in Islam. It's something that's to be enjoyed within the proper setting. In fact, in this Surah Al-Barak, which I have up here, sex in married life is openly recommended. It says, when wives have cleaned themselves after menstruation, you go into them as Allah has commanded. Give that to St. Augustine. Additionally, hadith sources, these are the traditions, illustrate a similar promotion of fulfilling sexual urges within marriage. For example, one tradition, and these are traditions, has Muhammad proclaiming, the whole world is to be enjoyed, but the best thing in the world is a good woman. A husband is obliged to treat his wife in the Quran in a kind and reasonable manner. This was a big upgrade from pre-Islamic tribal society. You know, it's often looked at, well, look at women in Islam. Well, you should have seen women before Islam. They, no rights, nothing. Part of that kind and reasonable treatment is intercourse, which is the husband is obliged to perform. So if he's obliged to perform, what does that say about sexual enjoyment for the female? That's accepted. It's not like only males can have sexual enjoyment, females as well, and the male is obliged to provide that for his wife. The majority of jurists have set a time limit, in fact, at 4 months, beyond which it is not permissible for the husband to have intercourse with his wife. So if the wife goes to a jurist and says, my husband is not treating me properly, that's grounds for divorce. Interesting. It's likewise obligatory on women not to refuse their husbands if they call them. Okay? So it's supposed to be mutual. It's mutual enjoyment within that specified institutional framework. So long as the woman who is called is not menstruating or sick, intercourse, so that intercourse would be harmful to her, or if she's observing the fast, then she's required to fulfill her husband's needs. So it's joint fulfillment of needs. Almost all of what is practiced under Islamic law, however, concerning sexual intercourse doesn't come from the Quran. It comes from the traditions. And that's understandable because traditions develop over time. Quran is sort of a general, but over time, well, you know, what if? What about this situation? What about this situation? And that's what law is all about. You start with the 10 Commandments and you end up with 80,000 laws. And that's what Chris's dad used to always say to me. Moses came down from the mountain with 10 Commandments. And then the lawyers got a hold of it. So in any case, but the main tendency within the Hadith shows that the husband and the wife should be completely free in engaged in any sort of foreplay they desire as long as it's not exploitative to one another. There are no restrictions on any techniques or foreplay. It's encouraged. Which is a very different view than we often get of Islam, right? Because you see these veiled women somehow behind the veil in the household. You know, that's, nothing's held back. That's okay. That's okay. Even in the case of what they call mutual masturbation, the Hadith says that's fine. You're not hurting anyone. And it isn't only for procreation. See, that's the key. We will find when we get to Catholicism and early Christianity, sexuality was only supposed to be for procreation. Enjoyment is probably, not in Islam. And I think it's important for people to know. In contrast to church teachings, coitus interruptus, you know what that means? Pulling out at the moment of ejaculation was allowed as a form of contraception in Islam, not allowed in Catholicism. No, nothing that would prevent a life is in Catholicism. That's why there's no contraception of any sort, and that was seen to be a form of contraception, not in Islam. It also needs to be pointed out there is nothing wrong for a woman to be active and responsive during sex. She had as much right to orgasm as did her husband. So I think these just, because that's not the image you get of these women in their burqas, okay? What's important in Islam is that it's restricted to private space. Sexuality in public space is what's really looked down upon. Purity was another important concept found in the Quran. We'll get there in a moment. There's always required ritualistic washing after you have sex. Okay? Again, somehow semen and possibly blood is seen as impure. So if that is part of you have to have a ritual washing afterwards. A washing afterwards probably isn't a bad idea, but this became ritualistic. Okay, although it's not mentioned in the Quran, circumcision was confirmed by the traditions, the hadith, and became almost universally practiced by Muslims. As in Judaism, the boy was generally circumcised 1 week after birth, although in certain countries there was the option of any time during his 3rd and 7th year. When we were in Tunisia with the Ali group, we were at a small mosque where it was celebrating the circumcision of boys this age. It's not as vicious or as you might think. It's done with anesthetic, etc. So there wasn't pain involved for these kids. It was a big celebration. Everyone was really happy. The Quran allows for polygamy. Again, this is an ancient culture. You can have up to 4 wives. Now you say, 4? Well, pre-Islamic Arabia, there was no limit. A man could have as many wives as he could afford or want. Muhammad limited it to 4. This is the injunction from the Quran. Marry such of the women as seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4. Now, but this is the key. But if you feel that you may not be fair, then take only 1. Most modern apologists have declared that since it is impossible to be fair or with several women, that men should only marry 1. Indeed, for whatever reasons, often economic, most Muslims throughout history have only been monogamous. But it is allowed in the Quran to have more than 1, because at the time that the Quran was revealed, this was a restriction. And it was often seen, again, we tend to think of marriage primarily as procreation, but there are all sorts of other aspects of marriage in these traditional societies. Now this is interesting. Unlike many other ancient cultures, the Quran required that the dowry, you all know what a dowry is, in the form of money or possessions, that's jewelry, home goods, etc., was to be paid by the groom. That's very unusual. In Hindu culture, it's paid by the bride, which means that if you have more than 1 daughter, you're in trouble. I met a man when I was in India who had 7 daughters. He said, I know I've done something really terrible in my last lives, because he had to pay for all the marriages, the dowry, the whole thing. In Islam, it's the other way around. The groom has to pay. And this is done by the groom's father at the time of marriage, and it legally became her property. Legally. As in most societies, adultery was punishable by death. However, there's all these little nuances in Quran. The law was somewhat reduced by the fact that there had to be 4 witnesses. You go figure that one out. In other words, this is a way of saying, okay, tradition says this is what should be, but you better be careful because this can be and we know this can be misused, right? Claiming things. There had to be 4 witnesses. Tradition also claimed Muhammad said, avert the infliction of prescribed penalties on Muslims as much as you can. And if there is a way out, let a man go. For it is better for a leader to make a mistake in forgiving a man than to make a mistake in punishing. Where does that question really come up in our culture? Capital punishment. Yeah. It's better to make a mistake one way than the other. As far as divorce goes, the husband would pronounce, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. He could take that back after a certain period of time, and it was always suggested that they get counseling. Well, that term wasn't used, but that they should find ways to reconcile, if at all possible. Under certain conditions, it was possible for a woman to petition a judge, especially physical abuse. Although not specifically sexual, except when it came to as sort of a symbol of eroticism, for Westerners during the colonial period was the veil. So let me say a few things about veiling. During Muhammad's time, women began wearing a headscarf. It's known as a hijab when in public or in the mosque. Here they were following the example of Muhammad's wives, who did so as a sign of both modesty. Do we know what that word means anymore? Modesty. Something with modern? And respect for the Prophet. The compulsory veiling of women does not seem to have begun until the center of the Islamic Empire moved to Baghdad, which was at least 100 years later. And it was not for almost a century after the religion's origin that women began veiling their faces. So that was not part of the Quran. The full burqa, which is often seen, this is what Islamic women are like, came much later. Some say from Central Asian influences, definitely not from the Quran, or perhaps even from the Byzantine and Persian empires, where the aristocracy would keep their wives, or what was known as the zanana, and we're reading a novel about that right now, in separate sections where they could not be seen by other than the king. So it was a veiling, and then it just sort of got to the... So it's important to know these distinctions. But as Islam spread, there became a vast literature dealing with all aspects of life, including sex. A good example, the 1001 Nights, written in Baghdad court in the, you guys are looking at something pretty, you're straining your eyes there. It's a little bit pornographic, but that's the cover of the book. It was written in the 8th century, in which sexual adventures were freely related between all manner of people, if you've ever read this. The very first story told of a king's wife being stretched on her bed and embraced by a slave. This is pretty erotic stuff. And it wasn't banned. It's just seen as for what it was. And while that's going on in a nearby kingdom, a queen undresses with her male and female slaves. It contains many examples of, it's also a lot of humor in this. There's a lot of comedy in this. As in the tale of Ali with the large member, which pokes fun at obsession with penis size. But although the 1001 Nights tells of all these sexual adventures, it often shows women enjoying intercourse as well as men, it's not a sexual manual, but it's rather a reflection on human fantasy. And it was seen as, okay, it's proper. It was fantasy. There were manuals later on in Egypt. For example, and I couldn't find an image for this, there was a book called The Book of Exposition of the Science of Coition. Coition meaning intercourse, which opened with the following lines. Praise to the Lord, who adorned the virginal bosoms with breasts, and made the thighs of women anvils for the spear handles of men. Other titles included The Maiden's Book, The Mysteries of Married Fruition, and The Compendium of Pleasure. And these were all within Islamic culture. Then there was, and we'll see more about this when we get to Hinduism, the erotic Kama Sutra was also translated into Arabic. If anyone knows anything about the Kama Sutra, well, you'll find out in a few weeks. It's a sexual, on the one hand, it's for it's aesthetic sexuality, the art of sexuality, but it does include a number of positions, which most people would find very difficult to get into today. If you've ever seen the temples at Khajuraho with the ladies, anyway, we'll get into that later. In the 15th century, there was something called the perfumed garden of sensual delight. The reason I'm saying this, you don't find anything like this in medieval Christian culture. Okay? Even though this might not have been mainstream, it's still, you wouldn't find this. It would have been, it was written by one Muhammad bin al-Nawazi. It presented opinions on what qualities men and women should have to be sexually attractive. There was likewise advice given on sexual technique. Mother Ruth, what was the lady that, Dr. Ruth, who just passed away, didn't she, this year? Yeah, an early Dr. Ruth, as well as warnings about transmitted diseases and recipes to remedy such maladies. Now get ready for this one. It also listed 35 names for the penis and 38 for the vagina. Now, if you have mutual names for things, they must be seen as somewhat significant. It contained a section on the interpretation of dreams and briefly described sex among animals. Again, try and picture this in medieval Christian culture. It would have been burned along with the author. Interspersed were a number of sexualized stories intended for amusement. Finally, when we're talking about sexuality in Islam, I need to say something about the number 72. Does anyone know what I'm referring to? This idea of the 72 virgins promised in paradise for martyrs.
Were there so many extra women?
Because
the men all went to war.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, there were extra women. I think the example of Muhammad's marrying his chief commander's wife is because, men were killed in battle all the time, so there were women. So that was one reason for explaining polygamy. Yeah. So in the Quran, in the Surah Al-Waqiah, a description of paradise includes the following passage. The early generations and later generations will be summoned to a meeting on a predetermined day. This is the day of judgment. Then you, O strayers from the path, will eat from the trees of bitterness, filling your bellies therefrom. But those who deserved bliss will be in bliss. Then there's the elite of the elite. They are those who will be closest to Allah. In the gardens of bliss, on luxurious furnishings, enjoying everything, they will be neighbors. Serving them will be immortal maidens with cups, pitchers, and pure drinks. They never run out, nor do they get bored. Fruits of their choice. Beautiful mates like protected pearls, rewards for their works. They never hear any nonsense therein, nor sinful utterances. Only the utterance, peace, peace. In lush orchards, fragrant fruits, extended shade, abundant water. We create for them mates, never previously touched, perfectly matched. Now, do you see any reference to virgin there? Only in the sense of purity. What's tended to happen with our language, if you go out and you're talking about virgins on the streets, people don't think you're talking about the Virgin Mary. You're talking about sexuality, Whereas there's nothing in this passage that says anything about sexuality. It talks about pure maidens. And by the way, there are also pure male cupbearers for females. So, the term that's used for maiden in Arabic is uri, Houri, which according to the most, except for the unsophisticated interpretations, has meant maidens who are the embodiment of purity. Does anyone know the game cricket? Oh, I can't tell this one then. In cricket, there's something called a maiden over. That's when a bowler bowls and no runs are scored, and it's a pure bowling. So that's what a maiden is. It's purity. The virgin is not a sexually related individual, but one who is pure. This is what is promised in paradise. Purity. There's no necessarily sexual implication. You can spin it if you want. You could provide sexuality in there if that's your end. But you know anything about language? You can do that with just about anything. You can take any phrase and take it and spin it and give it another interpretation. So I think it's pretty clear when you read the Quran and you read that language, we're talking about purity. That's what paradise is all about for Muslims, purity. Indeed, given the context of other Quranic passages, and there are many others, Uris represent perpetual chastity. That's what a virgin is. Perpetual chastity, purity. And like I said, it should be noted, women are not left out. There are parallel Quranic passages that indicate that in paradise, righteous women will get numerous male servants. So to make it clear, there's no reference in the Quran to support the idea of 72 virgins sexually awaiting each believer. The number 72 comes from a very questionable hadith, a tradition that reads, "The smallest reward, each for the people of heaven, is an abode where there are 80,000 servants and 72 wives, over which stands a dome decorated with pearls and ruby, as wide as the distance from Damascus to Yemen." So even here, it's 72 wives, which again is the symbol of purity. And that's a hadith. And many of the hadith are very questionable. It's not Quran. And it's always important to make that distinction, what comes from the Quran and what comes from the Hadith. Okay. Wow, right on it. So that's what we've, sexuality. Are there any questions? Next week we're going to turn, and it'll be solely on Christianity, because there's a pretty big range, and it's something perhaps you're a little more identified with, and some of the hang-ups you might have. In any case, we'll be dealing with sexuality in Christianity. So for the moment, are there any questions, comments?
The women for a head covering, not necessarily.
If you've seen the hijab, it's just over the hair.
Yeah. Is that where the Catholic Church acquired this notion that you should have your head covered when you went into?
It may have come from, because, early Islam spread right in. Much of the Renaissance was based on Islamic influence in Europe. I don't know that for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. But yeah, the face isn't required to be covered. And but it's become a big issue in France now whether women should be allowed to wear the hijab. It's an interesting question for feminists, by the way. If you're a feminist, do you say no hijab? Or do you say the woman has the right to make the choice? And then there's the question, well, is it her choice? Or is it, yeah. And all those subsidiary issues come into play. Okay. Any other thoughts, questions? Nope. Okay. Margie, you look like you're ready to say something.
I was thinking about hair, because, hair is an interesting topic in itself.
Yeah.
All the connotations we have with hair. I was thinking of the musical.
Oh, yeah, hair. Well, hair is...
Covering hair.
Yeah, hair has been very much sexualized.
Yeah.
When I grew up, nobody really cared what the boys' hair looked like, but women had all these different hairdos, and why? Because there's a sexualization with hair, whether you recognize it or not, in the culture. A bald woman was, my daughter, who was a little radical when she was young. Just one second, Joe, I'll tell you this and I'll get to you.
Somewhere, I think it was in a novel, but it might not have been, that in the Jewish faith, the ultra Jewish women, their heads are shaved, and then they wear wigs, and they don't go out in public without a wig on.
Could be. The question was, are in ultra-Orthodoxy, are women's heads shaved? I don't know that, but I know that, yeah, women don't go out in public. They keep their hair covered. Yeah. I was just going to tell you this one story about my daughter, and she's not here, but she's a little radical, and she grew up in Berkeley, so what do you expect? So one day, she comes home, and her head's completely shaved. And I looked at her, that was a shock. That was a shock to me. Why? Because somehow I had the image of a female had to have certain type of hair. So that was just part of my own psychological notion. She said, "Why are you looking at me like that, Dad?" I said, "Okay, I'm only looking at your soul, honey." Okay, so next week we'll dealing with Christianity and sexuality, and bring your questions. Okay.